Hello there, welcome back to my channel. My name is Pesky, and we've been reading through a book called True Ghost Stories, Real Haunted Hospitals and Asylums, since Halloween is just around the corner. So far, we've read about Waverly Hills Sanatorium and Taunton State Hospital in my first video, and then we heard about Old Chonky Hospital and Beechworth Lunatic Asylum in my second. You can certainly watch those two videos first, or you can just listen to this one and check them out later. Today, we'll be continuing on with Royal Hope Hospital and Metropolitan State Hospital. I have heard of neither of these, so this will be new for me and possibly for some of you. Now, without further ado, let's get reading. Royal Hope Hospital. St. Augustine, Florida is the oldest permanent European settlement in the United States. With it comes a long history filled with the struggle and suffering of a developing nation. Many wars left scars on early America, especially in the South. One hospital, called Royal Hope, witnessed some of the worst of it. Originally called Our Lady of Guadalupe, Royal Hope was first opened in St. Augustine as a Spanish military hospital, where it treated the sick and wounded from 1784 to 1821. It burned down, but was soon replaced by an exact replica to house the wounded of the Seminole War. Historians say that at least 70% of the men who came to Royal Hope survived the hospital, but given how long it was in operation, thousands found their final resting place here. Today, Royal Hope serves as a Spanish military hospital museum where visitors can learn about the war and how the soldiers were treated before modern medicine. However, a discovery by St. Augustine Public Works has left people wondering what was actually going on at Royal Hope all those years ago. Everyone knew that Royal Hope once kept a cemetery where soldiers could receive a proper Catholic burial after succumbing to their wounds. But a few years ago, workers were digging to repair plumbing near the hospital and were surprised to uncover piles and piles of human bones. Most people figured that the historians underestimated just how big the cemetery was. However, the bones themselves suggest a very different story. Why were so many bones piled together without any markers or organization? The discovery appeared much unlike a traditional Catholic burial, leaving locals to scratch their heads over what happened to all these people and wonder why their burial was kept a secret. Rumors began to fly that the hospital had been built on an ancient Timucuan Indian burial site, a likely idea considering the area. No one was ever able to confirm this one way or another, as the bones were quickly reburied where they were found out of respect for the dead. Even if the bones can't speak, the ghosts of Royal Hope sure seem to. As an active museum for the war, people regularly cite strange and unexplainable things that suggest the hospital has its own story to tell. Many visitors to the sick ward have witnessed old beds and furniture moving across the room on their own, sometimes bumping into their legs as if trying to draw their attention to something. Two tourists in particular spotted what they could only describe as a phantom. They claimed that it appeared in front of them only long enough to look at their faces before vanishing. Could it have been the spirit of a lost soldier? No one can say, though others have reported strange sightings that suggest that, at least in Royal Hope, the Seminole War still rages on. Many have heard the distinct sound of marching footsteps coming from the upper floor of the hospital that has been vacant for decades. Anyone who went upstairs to investigate the sounds discovered nothing. More have noticed the distinct and alarming smell of sulfur as if from gunsmoke, which improbably lingers after all these years. Other visitors to the hospital learned more than they bargained for about the despair and suffering that once permeated the building during its long history. Groans and shouts are often heard coming from otherwise empty rooms. The prayer room is particularly well known for these unexplainable noises. As the place where dying soldiers would have received their last rites, It was often a place of ultimate despair. Visitors can still feel it, describing strange feelings of loss and helplessness when entering the room. People often hear pained groans coming from the prayer room, accompanied by the hushed prayers of whoever guided the soldier into the afterlife. Passing away to the sound of soothing prayer may have been the highlight for many soldiers at Royal Hope. The strangled cries of one man can often be heard coming from the old apothecary, where workers administered pharmaceuticals to the sick. People who visit the room have reported seeing distinct shadows moving back and forth, as if lost, confused, or trapped. Could they be tortured souls from a disturbed ancient burial ground, unable to find peace in death? Many wonder. Today, the surgeon's office serves as a display room for the outdated and disturbing medical equipment used at the time. The equipment draws a lot of interest, especially because numerous visitors have witnessed it shaking all on its own. 2 different people have also confessed that they felt someone grabbing them and their clothes, refusing to let go until they managed to rip themselves free. Maybe the doctor's still in? They aren't the only ones who have admitted they were grabbed by some unseen presence. Several others have the scratches to prove it on their stomachs and backs. Some of the scratches even look like they could be attempts at a message. The word help. That might seem a little hard to believe, but the abundance of photo and video recordings of spooky, unexplainable apparitions surface from visitors to the hospital every year. Between the mysterious piles of bones and history of needless suffering at Royal Hope, it's no wonder people are witnessing so many confusing and disturbing messages from lives long lost. Whether or not you believe everything people say about the hauntings of Royal Hope Hospital, it's clear that someone on the other side has something to say as well. And that is the end of the Royal Hope Hospital reading. The next one is Metropolitan State Hospital. Haven't heard of this one either. We'll see what happens there. When Boston's Metropolitan State Hospital opened in 1927, no one had ever seen a psychiatric institution so expansive before. With an administration building, medical and surgical facility, acute and chronic care buildings, psychiatric hospital for children and adolescents, staff housing, morgue, and power plant, the grounds spanned over 3 different towns in the sprawling Boston region. It was made large out of necessity, but just 2 years after opening, the hospital had already exceeded its capacity of just over 1,000 patients. Of course, the hospital had to have its own cemetery to accommodate such an overcrowded facility. But mental hospitals have a patient limit for a reason, and the deaths at the Met appeared to be frequent enough that workers didn't even bother making proper markers for patients' graves. By the end of the hospital's operation, the cemetery ended up with 480 anonymous graves, and many more with no marker at all. Bodies sunken beneath the ground, their name and stories lost forever. Among the missing are likely the bodies of 24 child patients buried on the grounds in the early 1960s. Insanity in children had remained the most elusive mental illness for doctors at the time. The story goes that they were given a medication, strontium, mixed with their milk as an attempt to quell their unruly behavior. Instead, they were slowly poisoned to death. The overcrowding and underqualified hospital staff at the Met continued to take their toll in later years, though we can't exactly say what Melvin Wilson's motives were when he murdered co-patient Anne-Marie DeVie. It was 1978, and DeVie went missing without a trace. No one knew what to think of it for 2 months, until staff found a hatchet and pieces of DeVie's clothing with Wilson. Even more disturbing, he had been carrying around 7 of DeVie's teeth. Because it was pretty clear what had happened, the staff didn't bother to investigate further. It wasn't until the state mental health workers filed 19 reports of negligence that the Met let the authorities get involved. 2 years after DeVie's disappearance, Wilson led investigators to her 3 graves. You see, Wilson had chopped her to pieces and buried her in 3 different places on the hospital grounds. Though after so much time, it was difficult to piece her back together, and rumors still fly that parts of her are still out there, buried in other secret places at the hospital that Wilson didn't bother to tell anyone about. He was later transferred to a more secure facility, and the Met forever wore the new nickname, the Hospital of the Seven Teeth. With such a long and sinister past, it's no wonder that patients and staff alike began reporting unexplainable events, even when the Met was operational. The most frequent sightings were strange shadows that seemed to pass through the walls and halls, appearing in locked rooms as if they owned the place, then disappearing into the shadows. Too many times, nurses heard what sounded like a patient's desperate screams, only to find no one around. The voice was completely disembodied. Though none of that was as frightening as seeing the figures of long-dead patients appearing in their old rooms. For the workers, it happened frequently enough to make them question their own mental state. One unique feature of the hospital was the maze of underground tunnels. They were originally designed to help people move throughout the hospital during bad weather, though they weren't used often. The tunnels were lit by only a few light bulbs placed at a distance throughout the passage. Many staff reported feeling hands grab at their feet, faces, and backs when they walked through the darker areas of a tunnel, but were never able to see anyone there. The feeling of unseen hands frightened workers frequently enough that the tunnels were eventually repurposed for storage. People avoided them after that, though a company of contractors who later had to work in the tunnels mysteriously quit, refusing to go down again and offering no explanation. In 1992, the hospital closed for good. At an alarming rate, it became dilapidated, filled with a maze of rotting wards, mildewed plaster, asbestos, collapsed ceilings, and waterlogged tunnels. Even after the hospital shut down, the tunnels were filled with all sorts of beds, chairs, and equipment, left dripping and rotting in the echoing darkness. Most upsetting, the tunnels were left filled with patients' belongings, even children's shoes. No one knew why they would be there. Were patients living down there? As the hospital became more sinister looking, residents of the surrounding towns began to take more interest in the strange reports by the staff and patients who used to live there. Despite being barracked off from the public, thrill seekers frequently began visiting the Hospital of the Seven Teeth. It would seem that the spirits were becoming more vocal than before, now that their home had been abandoned. Heavy doors would slam for no reason, and disembodied whispers drifted down the hallway. More than one Boston local admitted that at times they felt as if they were experiencing the actual emotions of some long-lost patient. They also developed eerie memories of hospital procedures and practices that they could never have witnessed or known about before. With so many unmarked graves in the cemetery, not to mention Anne-Marie DeVie's remaining pieces, it's no wonder that the grounds are considered more haunted than the building itself. Many people believe that the tormented spirits of patients buried in unmarked graves still lurk, lost on the grounds. These believers might be onto something, as just a few years ago more than 15 people called the police for what they described as a woman trespassing near the building, except that she was glowing blue. By the time police arrived, the blue ghost was nowhere to be found, but the 15 witnesses remained adamant in what they saw. She was lurking near the entrance and appeared to be gardening, they all said. Since the Metropolitan State Hospital became one of the world's scariest places, people began recording all sorts of disembodied whispers and unexplainable apparitions that are too clear to deny. But the crumbling and rotting hospital made for a sore sight for Boston and the surrounding towns, while the mysterious sightings on the grounds continued to frighten locals and attract ghost hunters. By 2007, the hospital was completely demolished to make room for a complex of condos. It would seem that the eerie sounds, unexplained sightings, and desperate grabbing from the former residents were at an end. The stories and messages from the Hospital of Seven Teeth no longer heard. But then again, the cemetery and every unidentified soul within it still linger to tell their tale. And so that is the end of our second tale. It looks like we can probably do a third. Let's do a third in this one. It's somewhat short. This is Pripyat Hospital. If anybody's heard of Chernobyl, that's Pripyat. So let's get to reading about Pripyat Hospital and find out what's happening there. The MSCH 126 Medico-Sanitary, better known as Pripyat Hospital, once served the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Built in the 1970s with a 400-patient capacity, the state-of-the-art facility was the only hospital for Pripyat's 50,000 citizens. No one really knew how important a hospital would become on April 26, 1986. Around midnight that day, Chernobyl engineers performed a routine test on Reactor 4. Then something went terribly wrong, causing the worst nuclear accident in history to date. The nuclear fallout from Chernobyl was 4 times worse than the Hiroshima bombing, though few realized it during the hours and days that followed the disaster. Without knowing the nature of the accident, firefighters responded wearing protective suits while dousing the fire. Not long after, they were all rushed to Pripyat Hospital after being exposed to lethal doses of radiation. It was here that most of the 47 accident workers died. No one knows exactly what happened that night in 1986. While it's easy to see how the abandoned town gives people the creeps today, accounts of paranormal activity surrounded the town before the disaster in question. In the weeks leading up to the infamous explosion on April 26th, many reported seeing the most unnatural bird-like creature in the sky. The black monster had a 20-foot wingspan, sometimes appearing like a headless man, other times with red glaring eyes. The creature would later be named the Blackbird of Chernobyl. People who spotted the creature around Pripyat were later tormented by horrific nightmares and received mysterious, threatening phone calls before the disaster. Then, in the immediate aftermath of the explosion, several emergency workers claimed to see the winged beast circling through the smoke of the fire. Maybe the first responders who claimed to see the monster were losing their senses to the intense radiation poisoning. Or maybe the Blackbird of Chernobyl brought some kind of reckoning on the people of Pripyat while delivering not-so-subtle warnings in the week leading up to it. The chilling creature hasn't been seen in the ghost town since. Paranormal buffs can't help but draw a connection between the Blackbird of Chernobyl and the Mothman seen in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Also described as a large winged creature with red eyes, the Mothman was seen throughout Point Pleasant in the days leading up to the collapse of Silver Bridge on December 15, 1968. Witnesses also experienced terrifying nightmares and phone threats after encountering the creature. The similarities are striking, and it's unlikely that Ukrainian power plant workers had heard of the Mothman legend. Was this winged creature delivering some kind of warning to Pripyat and Point Pleasant, towns that were worlds apart but both heading for disaster? After the initial accident, the citizens of Pripyat were slowly evacuated over the next few days. Officials told them they could return shortly, so many left their possessions behind. In reality, they would never go back. Almost overnight, Pripyat had become an enormous ghost city and has remained that way for 28 years. The hospital, once considered so modern, now lies untouched, filled with dirty and broken furniture. Writing on the roof reads, "Health of the people, riches of the country." But it turns out the hospital could do little to keep the people of Pripyat healthy. Outside of the 47 deaths from the first response workers, the disaster at Chernobyl has had more long-term effects. Children who were living in Pripyat at the time have now reported more than 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer due to radiation poisoning. 9 of them have died so far. As radiation levels have reduced enough to make it safe for short visits to Pripyat, it's become popular for tourists and adventurers to visit the largest ghost town in the world. However, the hospital itself still has its dangers. In the basement, you can find all the suits worn by firefighters who responded first during the disaster. Even after 28 years, they still carry a lethal dose of radiation. It's generally believed that the ghost town of Pripyat is surely haunted, and visitors to the hospital in particular often feel like they are being watched. People claim to see apparitions or shadows, spirits of the victims of the Chernobyl disaster, mostly the firefighters who were rushed to the hospital from Reactor 4. Though it would seem that not quite all of them made it that far. A chilling account by Andrei Karsakov, a nuclear physicist who visited Chernobyl in 1997, suggests that some might still be trapped in the reactor. While taking some readings near the sarcophagus of the reactor, he heard the distinct sounds of someone screaming for help within the reactor core. I ran upstairs to tell someone, but they said that when I entered the reactor control room, I was the first person to open that door in 3 years, and the only way to get inside the old reactor is through the doors I came in through. If someone had gone inside the reactor when I was not looking, they would have tripped an alarm that goes off when the reactor doors open mechanically. Karsakov shrugged off the sounds and went back to work. But later that evening, while his team was eating dinner outside the reactor, a floodlight suddenly turned on in the same room he had heard the cries for help. They stared in awe, wondering how anyone could be inside. Just as they decided that it must be a power surge, the light vanished. Ghost hunters have since inspected Reactor 4 and to their shock found a human figure on their thermal imaging camera inside of the reactor. During the chaos of that fateful day in April, rushing the poisoned firefighters to Pripyat Hospital had been a futile effort, though it would seem that some of the men suffered an even worse fate, locked inside the infamous Reactor 4, where they remain to this day. And that's the end of the final story that we're going to be reading today. Pripyat, I've heard of. Anybody's heard of Pripyat if they've heard of Chernobyl. We all know about the disaster where their nuclear power plant basically melted down. They had to basically seal the entire plant. It's still sealed as far as I know. They still check on it now and then. They may still actually be building some more of the dome for it. I believe they were encasing it in a dome so that would never be accessed again. It was a horrible disaster. As for the Royal Hope Hospital and Metropolitan State Hospital, I had never heard of those before, but I'm sure that just like all of these other hospitals and asylums we've read about, you can probably find videos on YouTube, pictures on the internet. Just as with Pripyat, there are definitely ghost hunting shows about Chernobyl, and you can see the one with the thermal video. But our time is up for today, and we will be back next time. It was nice to be able to read 3 stories today. They were all pretty short. I'm not sure about the next one. I don't know if we'll do a 2 or we'll do another 3. But again, it has to do with time, and we'll just have to see how that works out. So I hope everybody has a great remainder of their day, morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is for you. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.